we have just had such amazing feedback about the last 3 events, and I'm so pleased to be continuing it today with a good friend of mine, an extremely accomplished anti-war activist, David Swanson. David he wears so many hats that I can barely list them all. He's an author of several incredible anti-war books and even a children's book. He is a radio show host and a journalist, a public speaker, an organizer, a community organizer. He is the director of worldbeyondwar.org. He is the campaign coordinator for Roots Action, which is involved in a huge number of incredibly important activism campaigns. And he is an all-round amazing person. He is here to speak to us. I'm going to give him 20 minutes to tell us his story about how he became an anti-war activist and what he's been working on ever since. Take it away, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susie. Let me know if anybody can't hear me okay, or if I'm too far off topic or over time, but I don't know if I can do 20 minutes just on how I got to be an activist. I may have to get into what the activism is, but I'm speaking to you from a little town in Virginia in the United States called Charlottesville that has been in the news lately as a place where racists hold rallies, neo-Nazis, fascists, the Ku Klux Klan hold rallies. And almost all of these people are from outside this town, outside this state, but they come here because there's a war statue that the city council in Charlottesville has voted to take down. And the reason I mention this, it's not anything to do with its being a war statue that puts it in the news or has people rallying to defend it or rallying against it. War in the United States has become so normalized that everybody from left to right is simply satisfied with war. The statue has its racist defenders and its anti-racist opponents. Yet, the reason it's still standing, although now two of the Confederate War generals on horses statues in the middle of Charlottesville now have black tarps of shame over them, but they're still standing, is because there's a law in this state, as in some other states in the United States, that says thou shalt not take down any war statues. And racist or otherwise, as if you can have a non-racist war statue. And and this is why I got involved in opposing war in the ways that I'm trying to. And I would object to Susie's generous description as accomplished, because we haven't accomplished ending war. But war has been so normalized in the United States that people don't even see it. When I grew up in Northern Virginia, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I was taught, like virtually every other kid on the planet, that it's better not to fight or to, try to use violence to solve problems. Yet I could see all around me that our biggest enterprise as a society, as a culture, was in organized mass killing. And mass killing has been so accepted in the United States in ways that are true in some cases in Israel and other countries around the world, but increasingly in the United States, everywhere you go, there are war flags and war songs and thank yous and discounts for members of the military and celebrations of the military. This is something that matters because the United States is not just any other country. It's a country that spends as much on wars as all the other countries put together, that, has at least 95% of the military bases on Earth that are on foreign territory, are U.S. bases on foreign territory. Nobody else, does this. Nobody has military bases here in the United States for their country. And so I've become part, as Susie mentioned, I've been become part of this campaign called World Beyond War, where the website is at worldbeyondwar.org, where we're trying through education about past wars, about the world, about the current state of affairs, and nonviolent activism, to move us away from this total acceptance of war, which, you know, is now increasing. And we have debates in US politics over whether to have a bigger government or a smaller government, and you know, a evil racist government or a good non-racist government, and it's all fraudulent. You know, that we have a racist president who replaced a supposedly non-racist president who was busy bombing several countries at a time, none of which were identified as, you know, being predominantly white countries. And we have a president who's proposed to move another $50 billion, you know, several percent of US government spending from everything almost other than the military into the military. Has proposed the exact same size budget as the previous year, but moving money increasingly to the military, which is already the majority of the money that the US Congress decides what to do with every year is already in militarism. He wants more. And the opposition, you know, is out there denouncing the cuts to the things they care about and avoiding mentioning the military, because that's just not done. You don't want to mention that the military costs money or be accused of opposing it. It's become so normalized and taboo to oppose. So we're trying to organize a global campaign against war, and have had some success and seen some advantages in it already. We, relevant maybe to this call, we have just lined up a volunteer coordinator for World Beyond War in New Zealand. And if you go to worldbeyondwar.org/New Zealand, you can get in touch with her and see what we're planning to do in that part of the world. But I think, you know, relevant to this issue of spying, which I claim no particular expertise on, war is, sorry, it's like 4 a.m. here. War is, as I see it, the overlooked reason why governments are able to claim powers to spy at all. You know, the actual motivations for government surveillance often include, you know, favors to corporations, suppression of opposition, of activism. You know, in the case of the United States, opportunities to dominate the globe and influence with carrots and sticks other nations' delegations to the United Nations, which are spied on by the US government, and so forth. But the rationale, the public justification, is principally war. If there were not foreign enemies, if there were not understood to be foreign enemies seeking to destroy us all, the US government at least would not get very far at all with arguments based on domestic crime or you know, arguments subtly backed by racism. Without the war justification for spying, we wouldn't have you know, public defense of unconstitutional and in violation of human rights spying programs in the United States, and we wouldn't have the United States engaged in surveillance around the world and in collaboration with other governments, suppressing activism, advancing corporate agendas, without that idea that there are and must be enemies, foreign enemies, military enemies, which are, you know, understood as being here among us as well in the United States now, with President Trump increasing now the programs that give the war weapons to the domestic police, allowing suppression of activism, but also allowing the purchase of more weapons for the war profiteers. And so when we make a case against war at World Beyond War, part of it is that war is clearly the primary way in which we lose our civil liberties, including the rights not to be searched and seized and spied on. And with every war, we have fewer rights to speak and assemble, unless we are, racists and Nazis coming to Charlottesville. Then you can speak and assemble and bring your semi-automatic weapons, no problems. But, for opponents of war to speak and assemble, we're not allowed to have rallies with, posters on sticks. We have to have harmless hollow cardboard tubes to hold up our posters, because nonviolent activists might harm someone. This is, this sort of suppression of rights. And Donald Trump is expanding the power of the police to seize cash and property without justification, without arrest, without conviction, and has just pardoned a sheriff convicted of racist, sadistic abuses and so forth. This all comes back to war and the way that war advances the understanding that we should lose our rights, that we should give up our rights because there's something more important, and the way war promotes racism and bigotry that couldn't be done without war. We also we can touch on any of these topics, and yes, they all have to do with why I got into activism. But we also make the case that war is the top destroyer of our natural environment, and in fact, the U.S. military ranks fairly high in a list of countries in consumption of petroleum and pollution of the skies and earth and water. Most countries spend far less on militarism and consume less petroleum and do less environmental damage as an entire nation than does the U.S. military. And it's, there are Superfund sites in the United States. These are environmental disaster sites that have been identified by the US government, which is saying quite a lot, as needing massive cleanup. 69% of them are produced by the US military. The damage the US military does just within the United States, much less in islands around the world, it's totally destroyed and used for bombing practice and so forth, is incredible. So we have a conference coming up in September that will be live streamed, and people are planning events around the world to watch the live stream, but it'll be in Washington, D.C., bringing together environmental groups and anti-war groups, because as with civil liberties groups that go after the spying and the torture and the lawless imprisonment and so forth, but won't mention military spending or war, from a certain perspective, are going after symptoms, but won't touch the disease. Major environmental groups also will not mention the top destroyer of the environment around, while, of course, ordinary environmentalists are generally willing to do so. And so across numerous issues, immigration / refugee rights, financial issues, the money, small fractions of what goes into the U.S. military / security / surveillance operations could end starvation on Earth, and numerous diseases, and the lack of clean drinking water, and the use of fossil fuels. This is really where the money is going. And we actually, to an increasing, although limited extent, have a politics in the United States willing to go after billionaires, willing to mention the concentration of wealth. And yet you could tax all the money away from all the billionaires once. and have what you could take away from the military each and every year after year after year. And that's unmentionable in corporate media in the United States. So, this is the case that we're trying to make against war. This is what got me involved in activism and eventually into anti-war activism, because there's no campaigns out there recruiting anti-war activists other than to a very limited extent groups like World Beyond War and other good peace groups, whereas there's billions of dollars put into recruiting new members of the military. So I had to find my way over a period of many years in getting into domestic activism and finally finding my way to anti-war activism. The reason for me is simple morality, is simply that this is the most destructive institution we've got, that is directly killing the greatest number of people and indirectly killing the greatest number of people, again, through the diversion of resources that could be being used to save people. And as I've gotten into it, I've, come to study to a greater extent the ways that people try to justify it, with the excuse that there might be a just war, a good war someday. This is, medieval doctrine that has, lingered beyond any other, centuries longer than any other aspect of the worldview of these, medieval monks who came up with it. But this case that there could be a just war someday is absolutely ludicrous, because the United States has been through the past 75 years since the last World War, bombing over 30 countries, engaging in increasingly permanent warfare, and none of the wars remotely meeting the criteria for a just war. In fact, most of the criteria for a just war being impossible to meet, others being incoherent, others being amoral, and all of the rest being, unmeasurable, non-empirical, simply rhetorical. And if you could have a war that met all the criteria for a just war, it would have to outweigh all of the blatantly unjust wars that are created by the military spending, preparing for that just war. And it would have to outweigh the murderous diversion of resources away from human and environmental needs into the war industry. So, there was a robber baron in a previous era of concentrated wealth in the United States named Andrew Carnegie, who had set up something called the Carnegie Peace Endowment, which, like any other, group in the United States, now works on anything but peace. But he gave the instructions to the board: you need to work on eliminating war and then have a board meeting, figure out the second most evil thing on earth and work on eliminating that. That, I think, is a basic understanding of morality, and so I always say, why are you a peace activist? I always ask, why are you not? What, give me an argument for a decent human life that doesn't work on ending the most evil things we've got, and replacing them with something good. So that's what I'm working on. And there are various projects now, that we can talk about. The treaty to ban the possession of nuclear weapons being a wonderful global project, the closing of military bases, the divestment from war profiteers, the educational project about what war is and how to end it. These are things that we're much stronger at if we work globally, if we work across borders. And of course, in the United States, I'm also involved in various other projects that are related, including a growing effort to impeach and remove our current president. So we can talk about that. If you pick up the New York Times this morning, you'll see an opinion piece about the, remarkably and somewhat misguidedly, predictably enough, but it's the New York Times, but remarkably outlining some of the benefits of a treaty that banned war in 1928 called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which I wrote a book about some years back, and which a couple of law professors at Yale University have now written a lengthy book about and put this op-ed in this morning's New York Times. But I'd be very interested to know what something like the Kellogg-Briand Pact is thought of in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world, as far as you're aware of, if it's thought of at all. And I think it's, worth mentioning, because here, when you even manage to get something into mainstream communications in the United States about a treaty that bans wars, and to thoroughly investigate over several years, as these professors and his whole crew of graduate students, did, all the benefits, the ending of the conquest of territory as something acceptable, and generally the ending of the conquest of territory, and all these dramatic changes in international law that happened in 1928 because of this treaty that's generally mocked by the few people who've ever heard of it. Even then, you get this exceptionalist view that war is something that's done by anyone other than the United States. And the big dangers to the new era of peace are the vicious Russian seizure of Crimea, and the Chinese and North Korean and Iranian belligerents, and so forth. That it's a very, very U.S. view.